Hello and welcome to History Sleep Stories. History often remembers leaders by the moment they rise. A dramatic victory. A triumphant speech. A crowd gathered beneath bright lights, cheering as a new figure steps forward to claim power. Yet just as often, history forgets them almost as quickly. Political life, after all, has a reputation for being unforgiving. Careers flare into prominence and then fade into quiet obscurity. Elections are won, then lost. Alliances crumble. Public favor shifts like desert sand under restless wind. And so the usual rhythm of power continues: rise, fall, replacement. But every so often, a political story refuses to follow that familiar rhythm. Some leaders do not disappear when the tide turns against them. Instead, they remain. They adapt. They endure. Few modern figures illustrate that strange durability more clearly than Benjamin Netanyahu, a man whose political life has unfolded not as a single rise and fall, but as a long sequence of collapses, comebacks, and improbable returns. As you settle in to listen to this sleep story, a like and a subscription are a quiet way to support this channel. And if you feel comfortable, you're warmly invited to share where you're listening from in the comments. To some, he is a symbol of determination, a leader who refuses to surrender in the face of pressure. To others, he represents something more troubling, a figure whose grip on power seems almost impossible to loosen. Supporters call him a guardian of national security. Critics accuse him of deepening divisions within Israel and reshaping its political landscape in ways that will echo for generations. Yet whether admired or opposed, one fact remains difficult to ignore. He has lasted. In a region known for political volatility, where governments can collapse overnight and reputations can vanish within a single election cycle, Netanyahu has managed to remain at the center of Israeli politics for decades. Leaders have risen around him, challenged him, defeated him, and then watched, sometimes with disbelief, as he returned once again. It raises a question that observers across the world have asked repeatedly. How does a political career survive so many storms? Because the storms have been many. Over the years, Netanyahu's path has passed through moments that seemed certain to end it all: bitter elections, fractured coalitions, public protests, corruption investigations, and crises that placed the entire region under global scrutiny. Each time, analysts predicted that his era had reached its final chapter. And yet, time after time, those predictions proved premature. Where other careers might have ended quietly, his continued. Where others disappeared into the background of history, he stepped forward again. This pattern has created something almost unusual in modern politics: a sense of unfinished tension around his story. Even when power slipped from his grasp, few observers truly believed the story was over. Somewhere in the background of Israeli politics, it always seemed possible that Netanyahu might return. And often, he did. Part of the fascination surrounding his leadership lies in that unpredictability. Political opponents have spent years attempting to construct coalitions strong enough to remove him permanently from the stage. Supporters have rallied again and again to defend his leadership during moments of crisis. Between those forces lies a political drama that has shaped the direction of an entire nation. Yet the story of such endurance rarely begins with power itself. Before the speeches, before the elections, before the long years of controversy and debate, there was simply a young man shaped by ideas, family history, and a world already defined by conflict. Long before he would stand before cameras as the leader of Israel, the foundations of his political identity were being quietly formed. Understanding that beginning matters, because political survival rarely emerges by accident. It grows from beliefs, from influences, and from experiences that leave a lasting mark on the people who carry them forward. And in the case of Benjamin Netanyahu, those influences began long before the world knew his name, inside a family whose ideas about history, identity, and survival would shape the path he would eventually follow. Long before Benjamin Netanyahu became a figure whose decisions would reverberate across the Middle East and the world, he was a boy in a household where history was not merely a subject but a lens through which life itself was understood. Born in 1949 in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu grew up in a home that blended intellectual rigor with an unwavering sense of purpose. His father, Benzion Netanyahu, was a scholar of Jewish history whose work on Zionism and Jewish identity shaped the very walls of their home, filling it with books, debate, and a sense that understanding the past was inseparable from shaping the future. In this environment, young Benjamin absorbed lessons that would later define his worldview. Discussions around the dinner table were rarely light-hearted, they revolved around the fate of nations, the rise and fall of empires, and the lessons embedded in centuries of Jewish struggle. Benzion's nationalist convictions were deeply held, and he imparted to his children an understanding of both the fragility and resilience of the Jewish people. From an early age, Benjamin internalized the idea that history was not just a record of what had been, but a guide to what must be defended and preserved. The household emphasized education above all else. Netanyahu's mother, Sila Netanyahu, supported this intellectual foundation by instilling discipline, curiosity, and moral responsibility. She nurtured his interest in literature and languages, complementing the historical and ideological lessons imparted by Benzion. Within these walls, Benjamin developed a dual sense of purpose, to understand the world deeply and to position himself as a participant in its unfolding drama. The combination of scholarship and moral urgency left an indelible mark on the boy who would one day navigate the turbulent waters of international politics. The family's ideological roots were inseparable from their lived experience. Benzion had emigrated from Europe and carried with him the scars and lessons of a continent that had repeatedly turned against its Jewish population. His writings and teachings were imbued with a sense of responsibility to defend Israel and the Jewish people, an ethic that young Benjamin internalized. Nationalism, security, and the preservation of identity were not abstract concepts, they were imperatives that required action and foresight. This early exposure to the intersection of ideas and consequence laid the foundation for a worldview that combined intellectual rigor with political strategy. Education extended beyond the home. Netanyahu attended the Hebrew University High School, where he excelled academically and demonstrated early signs of the strategic thinking and discipline that would later characterize his political style. Teachers noticed a precocious intellect, a capacity for debate, and a curiosity about global events that far exceeded that of his peers. Even in adolescence, he seemed to grasp that the world was a complex web of competing interests and that understanding it required both knowledge and decisiveness. Family also brought early exposure to loss and resilience. Netanyahu's older brother, Yoni Netanyahu, would become a national hero and an enduring influence on Benjamin's sense of courage and duty. Observing Yoni's dedication to Israel's security, the young Benjamin internalized a model of personal bravery intertwined with national service. These familial examples of commitment and sacrifice would later inform both his political philosophy and his approach to leadership under pressure. The intellectual household also nurtured skills that would later define Netanyahu as a communicator and strategist. He learned to argue persuasively, defend positions under scrutiny, and frame historical narratives to illuminate contemporary challenges. These skills were honed not in formal classrooms alone but through endless discussion, debate, and exposure to the moral and political dilemmas of history. By the time he reached adulthood, Netanyahu had already developed the capacity to analyze complex situations, anticipate opposing arguments, and articulate positions with clarity, traits that would become central to his public persona. Importantly, this formative period instilled a profound understanding of identity and responsibility. Netanyahu's family legacy was a constant reminder that leadership was not merely a personal achievement but a duty to a larger community. He absorbed the lesson that those who are capable of influence carry an obligation to act decisively, particularly when the survival or security of others is at stake. This sense of moral responsibility, fused with strategic thinking, would guide him through military service, diplomacy, and political office. By adolescence, Netanyahu was already contemplating the world beyond his immediate environment. Influenced by both his father's scholarship and his own curiosity, he developed a keen interest in global affairs, Jewish history, and the existential threats facing Israel. The intersection of these interests laid the groundwork for a life in which personal ambition and national service would become inseparable. The intellectual and ideological foundations of his early years provided not only knowledge but a psychological resilience that would allow him to endure public scrutiny, political defeats, and the pressures of high-stakes decision-making. In retrospect, Netanyahu's early life illustrates a central truth about leadership: the seeds of public influence are often sown long before a person holds office. The combination of intellectual rigor, moral conviction, and exposure to both triumph and loss created a psychological blueprint that shaped his decisions, ambitions, and strategies in later years. The boy from Tel Aviv, raised in a household steeped in history and responsibility, was already learning lessons in resilience, strategy, and the importance of legacy, lessons that would accompany him through decades of military service, political campaigns, and the complex theater of international diplomacy. By the time Benjamin Netanyahu entered adulthood, he was no longer merely the son of a historian. He was a young man equipped with a profound understanding of the stakes of leadership, the weight of history, and the importance of strategic vision. The intellectual and moral foundations laid in those early years would become the bedrock upon which a long and extraordinary political career would be built, guiding him through challenges that would test both his resolve and his capacity to endure where others might falter. Ideas about leadership often begin long before a person ever stands before a crowd. Long before the speeches, the elections, and the arguments of public life, there are quieter forces at work: family conversations, books on a shelf, stories told across dinner tables late into the night. In many ways, the political figure the world would eventually know as Benjamin Netanyahu was shaped during those early, less visible years. He was born in 1949, only a year after the modern state of Israel itself came into existence. It was a time when the young nation was still defining its identity and struggling to secure its place in a region filled with tension and uncertainty. The atmosphere surrounding Netanyahu's childhood was therefore not one of calm stability but of constant historical reflection and debate. Questions about security, identity, and survival were never far away. Much of that atmosphere came from his father, Benzion Netanyahu, a respected scholar whose life revolved around studying the long and often difficult history of the Jewish people. Benzion was not simply a historian who examined the past from a distance. His work carried strong convictions about the lessons history should teach the present. He believed deeply that nations survived only when they remained vigilant, strong, and aware of the threats that surrounded them. Growing up in such an environment meant that history was never merely an academic subject in the Netanyahu household. It was a living force, something that shaped how the future should be approached. Conversations were rarely shallow. Instead, they moved through centuries of struggle, exile, resilience, and return. For young Benjamin, listening to his father's reflections meant absorbing a worldview in which survival was never guaranteed, and leadership demanded strength. Yet the home he grew up in was not only defined by political ideas. It was also filled with intellectual curiosity. Books lined the walls, and discussions ranged from philosophy to history to the complicated dynamics of the modern world. Education was not simply encouraged, it was expected. In that environment, Benjamin and his brothers learned to analyze events critically and argue their perspectives with precision. Among those brothers was Yoni Netanyahu, whose presence would later cast a profound shadow over Benjamin's life. At the time, however, the three brothers were simply young men growing up in a family that valued discipline, study, and ambition. Each was encouraged to think not only about personal success but about responsibility toward the nation forming around them. At times, the family even lived abroad, particularly in the United States, where Benzion pursued academic work. These years exposed Benjamin to another political culture, one that valued debate, persuasion, and public communication. He became fluent in English and learned how ideas could be presented not only through scholarship but also through powerful rhetoric. This exposure would prove significant later. In a country where diplomacy and international perception mattered greatly, the ability to move confidently between cultures and languages would become one of Netanyahu's defining political strengths. But during those formative years, such outcomes were still distant possibilities. What mattered more immediately was the shaping of character. The discipline of intellectual debate at home mixed with the growing awareness that Israel's existence remained fragile. News of regional tensions and conflicts was not abstract background noise, it was part of everyday reality. For a young man coming of age in such circumstances, the question of service was almost inevitable. In Israel, military duty was not merely a civic obligation but a defining national experience. For many young citizens, it represented the moment when ideas about patriotism, sacrifice, and responsibility moved from theory into lived reality. Benjamin Netanyahu would soon face that same transition. The intellectual debates of his childhood had given him a framework for understanding the world. His father's historical convictions had instilled a belief in vigilance and strength. Yet the theories discussed around the family table were about to encounter a different kind of test, one that unfolded not in books or classrooms, but in the demanding and often dangerous world of military service. And it was within that world, in a unit known for secrecy and extraordinary discipline, that the quiet transformation from thoughtful student to hardened soldier would begin. When Netanyahu joined the elite Israeli Special Forces unit Sayeret Matkal, he entered one of the most demanding environments in the country's military structure. Admission alone required exceptional physical endurance, mental resilience, and an ability to perform under pressure that most people never encounter. Unlike conventional military units, Sayeret Matkal specialized in missions that often remained hidden from public view. Operations were planned quietly, executed swiftly, and rarely discussed afterward. Success meant silence. Failure could carry consequences far beyond the battlefield. For young soldiers entering this world, the experience was transformative. Training pushed recruits beyond ordinary limits. Long marches across harsh terrain, exercises that demanded complete trust between team members, and simulations designed to prepare them for unpredictable threats created an atmosphere where hesitation could not survive. Every movement required discipline. Every decision carried weight. In elite military units, silence often follows the most dangerous missions. Operations are completed, reports are filed, and soldiers return quietly to their routines. The outside world rarely hears the details. Yet every so often, a single event breaks through that silence and captures global attention. In those moments, the hidden world of special operations suddenly becomes visible. One such moment arrived in July 1976, during a crisis that began thousands of miles from Israel. An Air France passenger plane had been hijacked by militants and diverted to the airport in Entebbe, where more than 100 hostages were held under the watch of armed captors and the regime of Ugandan leader Idi Amin. The situation unfolded with a sense of dread that spread far beyond the families waiting for news. Around the world, governments watched closely, uncertain how the crisis would end. For Israel, the stakes felt especially urgent. Many of the hostages were Israeli citizens or Jewish passengers who had been separated from the others. As negotiations dragged on, the threat hanging over them grew heavier. Time, as it often does in such crises, became both enemy and pressure. Behind closed doors, Israeli leaders debated their options. Diplomacy offered no clear solution. The distance to Entebbe, more than 4,000 kilometers from Israel, made any military response seem almost impossible. Yet as the hours passed, another possibility began to take shape, a daring rescue mission unlike anything attempted before. Planning began in secrecy. The mission would eventually become known as Operation Entebbe, a plan that required extraordinary precision. Israeli commandos would fly deep into hostile territory under cover of darkness, land at the airport, and attempt to free the hostages before the captors could react. At the center of that mission stood Yoni Netanyahu, the older brother of Benjamin Netanyahu. Yoni had already earned a reputation for discipline and leadership within the same elite military world that Benjamin had known. Among fellow soldiers, he was respected not only for his courage but for a quiet seriousness that seemed to reflect the weight of responsibility he carried. When the mission began on the night of July 3, 1976, the tension surrounding it was immense. The aircraft carrying the commandos flew low across long stretches of territory to avoid detection. Every stage of the operation depended on timing, surprise, and the ability of the soldiers involved to act decisively under extreme pressure. Then, after landing at Entebbe Airport, the assault began. Israeli commandos rushed toward the terminal where the hostages were being held. In a matter of minutes, a fierce exchange of gunfire erupted. The soldiers moved quickly through the building, eliminating the hijackers and securing the passengers. The operation, astonishingly, succeeded. Within a short span of time, the hostages were freed and transported onto the waiting aircraft. For many watching the crisis unfold from afar, the outcome seemed almost unbelievable, a rescue carried out with speed and precision that few had imagined possible. Yet victory came with a cost. During the assault, Yoni Netanyahu was fatally wounded. Though the hostages were saved and the commandos returned safely to Israel, he did not survive the mission. News of his death spread quickly. Across Israel, the operation was celebrated as a remarkable military success. Around the world, observers praised the boldness of the rescue. But within the Netanyahu family, the story carried a different weight. Behind the headlines and public admiration was the quiet reality of loss. For Benjamin Netanyahu, the impact was profound. The brother he had grown up alongside, who had shared the same intellectual upbringing, the same sense of responsibility toward the nation, and the same demanding military environment, was suddenly gone. Moments like that alter the direction of a life. Grief has a way of sharpening certain questions. Why do individuals step forward to lead? What responsibility does one person carry toward the society around them? And how does a nation remember those who sacrificed themselves for its survival? In the years that followed, Benjamin Netanyahu would speak often about his brother's legacy. Yoni became more than a personal memory, he became a symbol of courage and commitment to the ideals the family had long discussed. But something else was changing as well. Until that point, Benjamin's life had largely unfolded within the spheres of education and military service. His experiences had shaped him deeply, yet they remained part of a private journey. After Entebbe, the connection between personal loss and national identity became far more visible. People listened when he spoke about the mission. They listened when he reflected on the meaning of sacrifice and security. The tragedy had given his voice a new authority, one rooted not only in ideas but in lived experience. Gradually, opportunities began to appear beyond the military world. The questions that had once circulated around his family's dinner table, questions about history, national survival, and leadership, were now intersecting with public life in unexpected ways. A man who had grown up surrounded by debates about politics and identity was beginning to find himself drawn closer to those debates on a national stage. And as the years passed, the path that opened before him would lead away from the hidden operations of elite soldiers and toward a different arena altogether. An arena where words, persuasion, and political strategy could shape the fate of nations just as profoundly as any military. The loss of Yoni Netanyahu did more than leave a quiet absence inside the Netanyahu family. It created a shift in direction, subtle at first, but powerful in its consequences. Grief has a strange way of forcing reflection, and for Benjamin Netanyahu, the years following his brother's death became a period of searching for purpose beyond the battlefield. Until then, his life had been shaped by two strong influences, the intellectual world of his father and the discipline of military service. Yet the tragedy surrounding the rescue mission at Entebbe airport seemed to draw those two paths together. The questions that had once been discussed around the family table, about security, survival, and the responsibilities of leadership, suddenly felt far more immediate. The heroism associated with Operation Entebbe captured global attention. For many observers around the world, the daring rescue symbolized courage and strategic precision. But for Benjamin Netanyahu, the event carried a far more personal meaning. His brother had commanded the mission and paid the ultimate price. As time passed, Benjamin began speaking publicly about terrorism, security, and the challenges facing Israel. What began as a tribute to his brother's memory gradually evolved into something larger. He organized conferences that brought together politicians, scholars, and military experts to discuss the global threat of terrorism. These gatherings attracted international attention, partly because they addressed a growing concern shared by many countries. Something else became visible during these discussions. Netanyahu possessed a natural ability to speak with clarity and confidence. Years spent studying history and debating ideas in his father's household had sharpened his analytical thinking. His time living abroad had given him a rare advantage among Israeli figures of his generation. He could communicate fluently with Western audiences, particularly in the United States. This skill soon opened new doors. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Netanyahu moved into diplomatic work. He began serving in roles connected to Israel's foreign relations, gradually building a reputation as a persuasive voice capable of explaining the country's security concerns to the international community. In a world increasingly shaped by television and global media, the ability to communicate effectively became an invaluable political asset. One of the most significant steps in this journey came when he was appointed to represent Israel at the United Nations. For many diplomats, the United Nations can feel like a slow-moving arena of speeches and negotiations. But for Netanyahu, the stage offered something else entirely: visibility. Standing before representatives from around the world, he presented arguments about Israel's security concerns with a calm yet forceful style that drew attention from journalists and political observers alike. Television appearances soon followed. Interviews, debates, and panel discussions allowed him to articulate his views beyond diplomatic halls. His confident manner and polished English made him particularly effective in international media. While many political figures struggled to translate complex regional issues for foreign audiences, Netanyahu seemed to thrive in that role. Gradually, a transformation was taking place. The soldier who once operated in secrecy had become a public communicator. The young man shaped by historical debates in his father's home was now participating in global conversations about security and diplomacy. And as his visibility increased, so did speculation about his future. Some observers began to wonder whether he might eventually enter politics directly. At the time, Israeli politics was already a fiercely competitive arena filled with experienced figures and powerful personalities. Entering such a field required more than intelligence or ambition. It demanded resilience, strategic thinking, and the ability to navigate alliances that could shift rapidly. Yet Netanyahu seemed increasingly comfortable in environments defined by pressure and scrutiny. The skills he had developed during years of military service, discipline, composure under stress, and the capacity to make decisions in uncertain conditions, now blended with his growing reputation as an articulate defender of Israeli policy. Supporters began to see him as a new kind of political figure, someone who combined security credentials with international communication skills. Still, stepping fully into politics would require another leap. Diplomacy involved representing a nation's policies. Politics required shaping those policies directly. The difference was significant, and the risks were greater. Entering the political arena meant facing elections, public criticism, and the unpredictable tides of public opinion. Yet for Netanyahu, the direction of his life appeared to be gradually narrowing toward that path. By the early stages of his public career, his name was becoming increasingly familiar to both Israeli voters and international observers. What began as a voice explaining security concerns abroad was evolving into something more influential. Inside Israel, political parties were constantly searching for leaders who could connect national security with effective diplomacy. Netanyahu's experiences seemed to position him at that intersection. And as the years passed, the question was no longer whether he would enter politics, but how far he might eventually rise once he did. By the early years of his public career, the name Benjamin Netanyahu had begun to circulate with growing frequency in political discussions inside Israel. What started as a reputation built in diplomatic halls and television studios was slowly evolving into something more serious. He was no longer simply a communicator explaining Israeli policy to foreign audiences. Increasingly, he was becoming a figure who might one day shape that policy himself. The transition from diplomacy to domestic politics rarely happens quietly. Political systems are crowded with rival ambitions, established leaders, and competing visions of the future. Entering that arena means stepping into a constant contest for influence. Netanyahu's entry into national politics therefore carried both opportunity and risk. He joined the Likud, a political movement known for its emphasis on security and national strength. The party had long played a central role in Israeli political life, but it was also navigating a period of change. The early 1990s were marked by intense debate about the direction of the country and its relationship with its neighbors. The peace process between Israel and the Palestinians had begun to reshape political conversations. Negotiations produced agreements that supporters hoped would lead toward stability, while critics feared they might compromise Israel's security. Few developments symbolized this fragile moment more clearly than the Oslo Accords, which attempted to create a framework for resolving decades of conflict. For Netanyahu, the moment offered both a platform and a challenge. He positioned himself as a skeptical voice regarding the peace process. While others saw opportunity in diplomatic compromise, Netanyahu warned that concessions could carry serious risks if security concerns were not fully addressed. His arguments resonated with voters who felt uneasy about the uncertain path ahead. Yet Israeli politics soon faced a shock that intensified those divisions. In 1995, the nation was shaken by the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, an event that stunned the country and left its political landscape deeply unsettled. The tragedy heightened emotions across Israeli society and turned political debates into urgent questions about the nation's future direction. In the months that followed, the next national election became one of the most consequential contests in Israeli history. Netanyahu emerged as the leader of the Likud party and presented himself as a candidate who could balance diplomacy with a firm commitment to security. His campaign relied heavily on communication skills that had already gained him recognition abroad. Confident before cameras and skilled in debate, he spoke directly to voters' anxieties about safety and stability. When the votes were counted in 1996, the result was remarkably close. But the outcome carried historic significance. Netanyahu won the election and became Prime Minister of Israel. At 46 years old, he was one of the youngest individuals ever to hold the office. For a man whose public career had only recently begun, the victory marked an extraordinary rise. Yet winning power and wielding it are rarely the same experience. The moment Netanyahu stepped into the role of Prime Minister, he entered an environment defined by constant pressure. Israeli leaders operate within one of the most complicated political systems in the world. Coalition governments require cooperation among multiple parties, each with its own priorities and expectations. Maintaining that balance demands negotiation not only with foreign governments but also with political partners at home. Almost immediately, Netanyahu found himself navigating intense domestic debates. Supporters expected him to stand firm on security concerns and resist diplomatic compromises they believed could endanger the nation. At the same time, international partners, including the United States, encouraged continued progress toward peace negotiations. Balancing these pressures proved difficult. Each decision carried consequences beyond Israel's borders. Agreements negotiated in quiet diplomatic rooms could ignite political arguments within parliament. Security incidents on the ground could quickly transform into international crises. For a new leader, the learning curve was steep. Yet Netanyahu approached the challenge with the same determination that had shaped earlier chapters of his life. He continued to emphasize security as the central pillar of his leadership. In speeches and negotiations, he argued that peace agreements must be built on firm guarantees that protected Israeli citizens. Critics sometimes accused him of slowing the peace process, while supporters praised his caution. The tension between those perspectives became one of the defining features of his first term. Meanwhile, the demands of coalition politics forced him to develop skills beyond public communication. Negotiating with allies inside the government required patience and compromise. Political survival depended not only on popularity among voters but also on maintaining enough support within parliament to keep the government functioning. At times, those pressures threatened to overwhelm the administration. Debates grew increasingly heated. Demonstrations appeared in the streets. International observers watched closely as the fragile balance between diplomacy and security unfolded under Netanyahu's leadership. For Netanyahu himself, the experience offered a first real taste of the immense complexity of governing a nation surrounded by regional uncertainty. It was no longer enough to argue ideas in television studios or diplomatic halls. Now every statement carried the weight of policy, and every policy carried consequences that could shape the lives of millions. The young prime minister who had risen so quickly was discovering that power, once obtained, demanded constant endurance. And as the years passed, the political storm surrounding his leadership would grow even stronger, testing whether his remarkable rise would continue or whether the same turbulent forces that had lifted him to power might soon bring his first era of leadership to an abrupt end. The first taste of power often carries a dual reality, exhilaration paired with the knowledge that it is fragile. For Benjamin Netanyahu, those early years as Israel's youngest leader were filled with both triumph and tension. Decisions had consequences, and the delicate balance between domestic politics and international diplomacy left little room for error. Every statement, every policy, every negotiation carried a weight that could tip either toward lasting influence or sudden downfall. As his first term unfolded, Netanyahu confronted the realities of governing a nation under constant scrutiny. Coalition politics, with its shifting allegiances and competing interests, demanded constant vigilance. His positions on security and skepticism toward certain aspects of the peace process drew both fierce support and sharp criticism. While his base praised his insistence on caution and principle, opponents accused him of rigidity and obstruction, framing him as a barrier to progress in a period when hope for peace lingered delicately in the air. The challenges grew more complex as international actors weighed in. While Israel faced pressure to move forward with diplomatic agreements, Netanyahu's caution often placed him at odds with key allies, particularly the United States, whose administrations encouraged compromise and dialogue with Palestinian representatives. Each negotiation, each speech abroad, added layers of scrutiny that could amplify any misstep into a political liability. For a new leader, this was a relentless test of endurance and adaptability. Domestically, the political landscape was shifting. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin and the subsequent rise of new voices had already redefined expectations. Public opinion was volatile, and Netanyahu found himself navigating the expectations of a divided electorate while attempting to maintain the cohesion of a fragile coalition. Even minor disagreements within parliament could threaten legislative progress and destabilize the administration. The pressures were immense, and the young prime minister quickly realized that political survival required a balance of firmness, negotiation, and foresight. Despite his determination, the political tides began to turn against him. Elections are unforgiving, and the combination of internal criticism, contentious public debates, and external pressures created an environment where maintaining power became increasingly difficult. Polls reflected growing dissatisfaction among voters who desired change, and opposition parties consolidated their efforts, presenting alternatives that appealed to citizens weary of ongoing political friction. When the next election cycle arrived, the result was definitive: Netanyahu lost his position as prime minister. For many observers, this defeat seemed like the natural conclusion of a turbulent first term. Analysts speculated that his career in national leadership might be over. The combination of domestic opposition, complex international pressures, and the enduring consequences of controversial decisions appeared to signal an endpoint. Columns in newspapers and commentary on political programs repeatedly framed his departure as a turning point, suggesting that Israel's political stage would no longer include him in a central role. The sense of finality extended beyond media speculation. Within political circles, rivals began consolidating power, assuming that Netanyahu's influence had waned. Coalition leaders, former colleagues, and emerging political figures all interpreted the loss as an opportunity to reshape priorities and guide the country in directions previously constrained by his leadership. For a man whose public life had been defined by ambition and resilience, the shift was stark and unsettling. Yet even in this period of apparent defeat, a more subtle form of endurance was taking shape. Netanyahu had already demonstrated an unusual capacity to withstand pressure and adapt to changing circumstances. His experiences as a soldier, diplomat, and negotiator had instilled in him a sense of persistence that did not dissolve with temporary setbacks. What some observers interpreted as the end, he would later treat as a pause, a moment to observe, reflect, and prepare for the possibilities still ahead. During these years outside the office of Prime Minister, he did not disappear from public life entirely. Instead, he focused on rebuilding alliances, refining his arguments, and maintaining a visible presence both domestically and internationally. He continued speaking on issues of national security, engaging with the media, and cultivating relationships with political figures who could support a future return. In doing so, he maintained a foundation that would allow him to step back into power when conditions were favorable. The narrative of defeat created suspense not only among political insiders but also for the wider public. Was this truly the end of Netanyahu's political influence, or merely a temporary setback? That question hung over the Israeli political landscape like an unspoken challenge, generating both curiosity and tension. Observers could not predict whether the same man who had weathered the pressures of a first term would rise again or fade quietly from prominence. In retrospect, this period would come to define an essential aspect of his leadership: the ability to endure, to observe, and to return with renewed strategy. The fall, dramatic and complete though it appeared at the time, was not a conclusion but a prelude. It tested not only his skill and resolve but also the patience, timing, and strategic foresight that would characterize his remarkable comebacks in the years to follow. And as the nation turned its attention to new leaders, Netanyahu was already quietly preparing for the stage he would re-enter, knowing that political endings are rarely permanent when resilience and ambition intertwine so firmly with opportunity. Even as many believed that Benjamin Netanyahu's political story had ended, the rhythms of Israeli politics were quietly preparing a stage for his return. The years away from office were far from idle. Behind closed doors, Netanyahu analyzed the shifts that had occurred during his absence, studying the failures and successes of others, observing how alliances formed and dissolved, and noting the concerns that resonated with the electorate. In these quiet years, he was reconstructing the tools he would need, not merely to survive, but to dominate. Politics, as he had already learned, is a game of timing. Opportunities rarely arrive exactly when one hopes. Instead, they appear subtly, waiting for those prepared enough to recognize and seize them. By the late 2000s, the political climate in Israel had evolved. Fragmented coalitions and ideological divisions had created a landscape in which no single leader could easily command lasting authority. For Netanyahu, this offered the perfect opening. His reputation as a disciplined, experienced leader who could navigate both domestic and international challenges remained intact, and many voters remembered him as a figure capable of balancing firmness with diplomacy. The 2009 elections became the turning point. Netanyahu approached the campaign with meticulous strategy. Unlike his first term, which had been shaped largely by immediate circumstances and reactive decisions, his comeback was deliberate and calculated. He carefully positioned himself as a candidate who could stabilize the government, provide security, and restore international confidence, while simultaneously appealing to domestic voters anxious about ongoing tensions and economic uncertainty. Every speech, media appearance, and policy proposal was crafted to reinforce the image of a leader who had learned from past experiences and emerged stronger. His efforts bore fruit. The electorate responded to his combination of authority, familiarity, and perceived competence. In a victory that surprised some analysts yet delighted supporters, Netanyahu returned to the Prime Minister's office, marking the beginning of a new chapter in his career, one defined not by a fleeting term but by prolonged influence. At this point, it became clear that his political life was not merely resilient, it had entered a phase of extended dominance. This period of power was characterized by both consistency and strategic flexibility. Netanyahu demonstrated an ability to manage complex coalition governments while maintaining firm control over key policies. He was careful to align with parties and individuals whose support could stabilize his administration, even if ideological differences existed. These alliances were less about ideological purity and more about practical governance, reflecting his recognition that sustaining influence in a fragmented political system required negotiation, compromise, and a keen understanding of timing. Internationally, Netanyahu leveraged his experience and established reputation to enhance Israel's standing. He cultivated relationships with leaders across the globe, reinforcing strategic partnerships while ensuring that Israel's concerns about security, regional instability, and terrorism were clearly communicated. Unlike his first term, when foreign diplomacy had sometimes been a source of tension, he now used it as a tool to strengthen domestic legitimacy, demonstrating that capable leadership abroad could reinforce authority at home. Yet extended power inevitably attracts scrutiny. The longer a leader remains in office, the more opportunities arise for opposition voices to challenge policies, question motives, and critique decisions. Netanyahu navigated this with a combination of firmness and tactical maneuvering. He maintained visibility, communicated directly with citizens, and managed the media in ways that framed his policies positively while diminishing potential political threats. His resilience was not only structural but psychological. He seemed unshaken by criticism, controversy, or the constant pressures of leadership. During these years, the archetype of the comeback became central to his narrative. His personal story, the fall, the observation of political dynamics from the sidelines, and the eventual return, resonated deeply with supporters. It illustrated an essential principle of leadership, that endurance and strategic patience can transform apparent defeat into renewed authority. This narrative also inspired admiration among citizens who valued persistence and vision, strengthening his electoral base and amplifying his political influence. The extended tenure allowed Netanyahu to shape the long-term trajectory of Israeli politics. Policies in security, diplomacy, and internal governance reflected a continuity that his predecessors had struggled to maintain. Initiatives were not merely reactionary, they were part of a broader vision, one that combined historical awareness, realpolitik, and a clear understanding of both domestic and international dynamics. Moreover, his comeback demonstrated the importance of perception. By projecting confidence, experience, and decisiveness, Netanyahu managed to reinforce the public's view that he was uniquely suited to guide the country through turbulent times. His ability to embody stability in an often unstable political environment became one of his defining features, reinforcing the idea that political skill and personal resilience are inseparable. The period following 2009 was thus more than a return to office, it was a consolidation of power. Netanyahu's political story, once marked by abrupt losses and uncertainty, had transformed into a narrative of sustained dominance. Every alliance he forged, every policy decision he navigated, and every public appearance he made contributed to the image of a leader who not only survived adversity but had mastered it. In this way, his comeback was not merely personal, it reshaped the very nature of Israeli politics. What had once seemed like a brief and fragile ascent had become a prolonged era in which Netanyahu's influence touched every aspect of governance, diplomacy, and national discourse. And as the nation watched him navigate both challenges and successes, one truth became increasingly clear: this was a leader whose ambition and resilience had redefined the limits of political survival, setting the stage for the conflicts, controversies, and historic decisions that would dominate his tenure for years to come. Once a comeback transforms into an extended tenure, leadership enters a different realm. For Benjamin Netanyahu, the years following his return to power in 2009 were defined not merely by the tasks of governance but by the consolidation of influence across the political, social, and international spheres. He was no longer simply the prime minister who had regained office, he had become the central architect of Israel's policies, shaping the nation's trajectory with a mix of strategic calculation, ideological consistency, and an acute awareness of timing. One of the defining features of this era was the careful cultivation of alliances that extended beyond party politics. Domestically, Netanyahu maintained coalitions that balanced competing interests, ensuring that parliamentary support remained sufficient to pass key legislation and safeguard his administration. His approach was pragmatic, ideological alignment often yielded to the demands of political survival. By demonstrating flexibility in alliances while maintaining a clear public identity as a firm defender of Israeli security, he reinforced both loyalty among supporters and an image of unshakable authority. Internationally, Netanyahu's tenure was marked by an extraordinary focus on foreign policy, particularly his strategic relationship with the United States. Over successive administrations, he cultivated ties with presidents, secretaries of state, and key congressional figures, ensuring that Israel's security concerns remained central to the U.S. diplomatic agenda. These relationships were not merely ceremonial, they provided Israel with a level of global support and legitimacy that reinforced his domestic authority. Netanyahu understood that in a world where international perception influences national confidence, a strong alliance with the United States could amplify both policy effectiveness and political resilience. Security strategy became a hallmark of his era. Netanyahu consistently emphasized the threats posed by regional instability, terrorism, and the development of nuclear capabilities by neighboring states. Under his leadership, Israel undertook defensive and preventive measures designed to maintain a strategic advantage, employing both overt military actions and covert intelligence operations. These decisions often drew global attention, reinforcing Netanyahu's image as a leader attuned to the harsh realities of a volatile region. While controversial at times, his policies strengthened his support among constituents who prioritized security and viewed assertive leadership as essential. At the same time, his era of dominance was characterized by an intricate understanding of power dynamics, both inside Israel and abroad. Netanyahu demonstrated an ability to anticipate challenges, leverage influence, and negotiate complex situations in ways that few other leaders could. From managing internal opposition to navigating sensitive diplomatic negotiations, he operated with a blend of caution and decisiveness that allowed him to maintain authority in a country where political fortunes could shift overnight. The longevity of his rule also reflected his mastery of public perception. Netanyahu consistently communicated his priorities and vision with precision, using media appearances, speeches, and public addresses to shape both domestic and international narratives. He projected confidence, authority, and clarity, framing his policies as necessary responses to existential challenges. In doing so, he reinforced the perception that his leadership was indispensable, further solidifying his political longevity. Domestic policy during this period was equally strategic. Netanyahu prioritized measures that strengthened Israel's economy, infrastructure, and social stability, often emphasizing growth and innovation as markers of effective governance. While his policies occasionally sparked debate and dissent, they contributed to a narrative of competence and progress that resonated with voters seeking stability in uncertain times. By aligning policy initiatives with both security concerns and tangible economic results, he maintained credibility across a wide spectrum of the electorate. Throughout this era, Netanyahu faced repeated tests, elections, coalition negotiations, and crises that could have destabilized lesser leaders. Yet time and again, he demonstrated a capacity to respond with strategic foresight. Whether addressing diplomatic tensions with regional neighbors, managing international criticism, or navigating internal party disputes, he balanced assertiveness with calculated restraint, ensuring that challenges rarely undermined the broader narrative of effective leadership. Crucially, his rule was sustained not only by political skill but by an understanding of timing and momentum. Netanyahu recognized when to push forward aggressively and when to consolidate gains, a pattern that allowed him to survive controversies and navigate scandals more effectively than most politicians. Even in moments when public opinion fluctuated or opposition forces grew louder, he used strategic messaging and calculated alliances to maintain dominance. This era of extended leadership also reshaped the perception of Israel on the global stage. Netanyahu's assertive policies, combined with his ability to articulate the nation's strategic concerns, amplified Israel's voice in international forums and reinforced the perception of a country guided by experienced and decisive leadership. His presence became synonymous with the direction of Israeli policy, cementing a legacy of enduring influence. By the mid-2010s, it was clear that Netanyahu had accomplished something rare in modern politics. He had transformed a comeback into an era of dominance. His skillful management of alliances, strategic focus on security, mastery of public perception, and global diplomacy all contributed to a sustained period of political authority. More than a prime minister, he had become a central figure whose decisions shaped the contours of Israel's domestic politics and international standing alike. Ultimately, this long tenure revealed a core truth about his leadership: political longevity is rarely the result of chance. It requires vision, adaptability, and a relentless understanding of both internal and external dynamics. Netanyahu's era of dominance exemplified this principle, illustrating how resilience, ambition, and calculated strategy can combine to sustain power far longer than conventional expectations would suggest. Even as his policies and alliances evolved over time, one constant remained: a focus on survival, authority, and influence that defined every decision. This era would set the stage for the controversies, electoral challenges, and historic decisions that would continue to mark Netanyahu's enduring presence in Israeli politics. Even during periods of unprecedented influence, no political career remains untouched by controversy. For Benjamin Netanyahu, the era of dominance that followed his 2009 comeback brought not only authority and recognition but also scrutiny, opposition, and legal challenges that would test the resilience he had built over decades. Political life, after all, rarely allows any leader to remain unchallenged for long. Every policy, every alliance, and every public statement became a potential source of conflict. By the mid-2010s, Netanyahu's long tenure had sparked intense debate within Israel. Critics accused him of consolidating power at the expense of political norms, while supporters argued that his decisions were necessary to maintain national security and stability. These debates extended far beyond the halls of parliament. Public protests filled streets, and social media amplified voices on both sides of the political spectrum. The divisions were stark, with citizens increasingly polarized over his leadership style, policy choices, and the broader direction of the nation. Amid this growing tension, legal challenges began to emerge. Investigations into allegations of corruption, including accusations of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, became a focal point of political discourse. Journalists and opposition leaders scrutinized Netanyahu's relationships with business figures and his handling of state resources, questioning whether the prime minister's personal interests were influencing policy decisions. Every report fueled public debate, creating an atmosphere in which trust and skepticism existed in equal measure. The legal proceedings themselves were complex and highly publicized. Court hearings, media coverage, and political commentary converged to place Netanyahu under intense scrutiny. For a leader accustomed to navigating international diplomacy and domestic coalition politics, this represented a different kind of challenge, one in which the rules were formal, the stakes were personal, and the public eye was relentless. Each development became a test of not only legal acumen but also political strategy. Simultaneously, opposition forces in Israel intensified their efforts to challenge his authority. Rival parties sought to exploit controversies, presenting themselves as alternatives capable of restoring accountability and transparency. Parliamentary debates grew increasingly heated, and coalition negotiations became more fraught. In this environment, Netanyahu's political skills were constantly under examination. He relied on a combination of strategic alliances, media management, and appeals to loyal supporters to maintain a position of influence. Public opinion, however, remained divided. Some citizens rallied in defense of Netanyahu, emphasizing his record on security, economic growth, and international diplomacy. Others criticized what they saw as an erosion of political integrity, questioning whether prolonged tenure combined with legal scrutiny had undermined democratic norms. Street protests, political demonstrations, and vocal debates on television and online created an atmosphere of constant tension, making each day in office a test of endurance. The controversies were further complicated by the global dimension of Netanyahu's leadership. As a figure who had long engaged with international leaders, every legal or political challenge in Israel reverberated abroad. Allies, rivals, and observers closely monitored developments, assessing both the implications for regional security and the stability of the Israeli government. Netanyahu's capacity to maintain relationships while navigating these storms became crucial, as missteps could influence not only domestic politics but also international perceptions of Israel's leadership. Amid the legal battles and political storms, Netanyahu demonstrated a remarkable ability to endure scrutiny without losing momentum. His public addresses and media appearances were carefully calibrated to project confidence and authority, framing challenges as external pressures rather than personal failings. By controlling the narrative, he maintained credibility among supporters while complicating the efforts of critics to define the story unilaterally. The interplay between legal challenges, public opinion, and parliamentary maneuvering highlighted the extraordinary complexity of political survival at the highest levels. Every allegation, every court decision, and every protest became part of a broader narrative in which Netanyahu's resilience was both tested and reinforced. The stakes were immense. Failure could have ended his long career, yet each challenge also offered opportunities to demonstrate strategic acumen and fortitude. What emerged during this period was a portrait of a leader capable of navigating overlapping crises, legal, political, and social, without succumbing to pressure. By reinforcing his base, maintaining key alliances, and projecting decisiveness, Netanyahu transformed moments of potential vulnerability into opportunities for consolidation. The controversies, while destabilizing for many, became another arena in which his skill at survival and political calculation was made evident. Even in the face of allegations and protests, Netanyahu's enduring influence suggested a paradox. The very storms that threatened his leadership also highlighted the depth of his resilience. His ability to confront criticism, withstand legal scrutiny, and maintain authority despite intense opposition underscored a central theme in his career, one that had been evident from the earliest days of military service through his diplomatic endeavors, political comebacks, and era of dominance. By the late 2010s, it was clear that Netanyahu's position was no longer simply about political office. It had become a test of endurance, perception, and strategy. Each controversy, trial, and protest contributed to the unfolding narrative of a leader who could survive, adapt, and continue to shape the course of Israeli politics even under the most intense scrutiny. The storms surrounding him would persist, but they would also define the remarkable persistence and ambition that had become synonymous with his leadership. Even as Benjamin Netanyahu had mastered the art of prolonged political dominance, the Middle East was entering a period of seismic turbulence that would redefine not only his leadership but the very fabric of regional stability. Domestic controversies and legal battles had tested his endurance, but nothing in his political journey compared to the enormity of the crises that would force him to confront war on multiple fronts, conflicts that carried not just national stakes but global implications. The spark for the most intense chapter of this era was lit on October 7, 2023, when Hamas, a militant organization controlling the Gaza Strip, launched an unprecedented multi-front assault on Israeli communities, killing over 1,000 people and taking scores of hostages, the deadliest violence in decades. The scale and ferocity of the attack stunned the nation and the world, immediately plunging Israel into a war that would consume public attention and strategic focus for years. Netanyahu's response was swift and decisive. In his first hours after the assault, he declared a state of war and ordered a massive mobilization of reserves, stressing that Israel would respond with force unmatched in intensity. This initial response set the tone for what would become one of the most protracted and complex conflicts of the 21st century. The campaign against Hamas was not merely military, it evolved into a deeply symbolic struggle over security, identity, and national survival. Ground operations, airstrikes, and naval support aimed to dismantle the militant group's infrastructure. Entire neighborhoods in Gaza became battlegrounds, and the massive displacement of civilians drew global attention and controversy. Aid organizations decried the humanitarian toll even as the Israeli government insisted that eliminating the threat from Hamas was an existential imperative. While this conflict shook the region, it also opened wider fault lines. Multiple Iranian-backed militias and allied forces reacted to the war by escalating their own operations. Hezbollah, stationed across Israel's northern border and supported by Iran, initiated rocket barrages and skirmishes that echoed the intensity of the Gaza front. These exchanges triggered mass evacuations of border towns and intensified fears that Israel was teetering on the edge of a broader regional war. The broader struggle between Israel and Iran, long simmering beneath the surface through proxy battles, also accelerated into direct confrontation. What had once been largely indirect clashes evolved into increasingly explicit acts of force. Coordinated airstrikes, counterattacks, and military escalations marked a profound shift in the regional dynamic. By 2025 and early 2026, Israel and the United States launched joint military strikes deep inside Iran, targeting key military sites and leadership compounds in an operation that dramatically inflamed tensions across the Middle East. This escalation had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Iran retaliated with ballistic missiles and drone strikes targeting Israel and eastward toward Gulf states hosting Western forces. The conflict rapidly expanded into a multinational crisis, drawing in nations as diverse as Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iraq, and even Cyprus as Iranian drones and missiles struck military targets there. This broadening of hostilities transformed what might have been a bilateral war into a regional confrontation with global economic and political repercussions. Amid this volatility, Netanyahu found himself navigating pressure not only from militant adversaries but also from allied governments and global institutions urging restraint. Western leaders, including those in Europe and beyond, called for de-escalation, while analysts warned of severe disruptions to global energy supplies, rising oil prices, and the risk of a prolonged conflict that could destabilize world markets. Yet domestically, Netanyahu's stance remained resolute. In speeches and public addresses, he framed the confrontation as a necessary defense against existential threats. He emphasized that Israel could not tolerate attacks from militant groups or hostile states backed by Tehran. Even critics within Israel, including some opposition figures, temporarily paused political disputes, rallying around a narrative of national unity in the face of external danger. However, external unity could not erase the deep fractures in global perception. While some nations and leaders supported Israel's right to self-defense, others condemned the scale of military operations and the humanitarian crises that accompanied them. Debates surged in international forums over proportionality, civilian protection, and the future of diplomatic solutions. For Netanyahu, these debates were not abstract, they carried direct consequences for Israel's international standing, economic partnerships, and diplomatic leverage. Amid the chaos, new forms of warfare reshaped public consciousness. Missile barrages, drone swarms, cyber attacks, and aerial bombardments became daily headlines. Urban centers felt the threat of sudden strikes. Evacuation orders and air raid sirens became routine across regions previously thought safe. For Israelis and their leaders, uncertainty became a defining condition of daily life, and the demands on Netanyahu's leadership became ever more intense. This period revealed the most acute test of his political career. Throughout decades of service, he had negotiated alliances, faced legal scrutiny, and managed domestic policy. But leading a nation through a multi-front regional war, one that ignited global debate and drew international powers into direct action, was an unparalleled challenge. Netanyahu's leadership under these extreme pressures highlighted both the strengths and vulnerabilities of his long rule. To supporters, his firmness reinforced the belief that strong leadership is essential during crisis. To critics, the scope and intensity of military action raised questions about strategy, accountability, and the search for peaceful resolution. Whatever the perspective, one fact remained clear: in a region where political stability is rare and global attention is unceasing, the era of Netanyahu's influence was now defined not only by longevity but by leadership tested under fire, a test that would shape his legacy and the future of the Middle East for years to come. Even after decades in power, legal battles, wars, and unrelenting scrutiny, Benjamin Netanyahu remains a figure whose impact cannot be ignored. His career is a mosaic of resilience, ambition, and controversy, a story that continues to evoke admiration, criticism, and debate in equal measure. From his early years shaped by an intellectual household and military discipline to his dramatic comebacks and long periods of political dominance, Netanyahu's journey has been anything but ordinary. Supporters view him as a leader who embodies strength and determination. They emphasize his strategic acumen, his ability to navigate Israel through regional instability, and his talent for forging international alliances, particularly with powerful nations like the United States. To them, Netanyahu represents a guardian of Israel's security, a decisive force in diplomacy, and a master of political survival who transformed setbacks into opportunity. His endurance in the face of legal scrutiny, protests, and electoral challenges reinforces the perception of a leader who refuses to be undone by circumstance. Critics, however, see a very different legacy. They point to allegations of corruption, political polarization, and moments of aggressive decision-making as evidence that his tenure was as divisive as it was enduring. Prolonged dominance, they argue, sometimes came at the expense of democratic norms, coalition harmony, and social cohesion. For many, the controversies and trials that marked his later years cannot be separated from the narrative of achievement, raising complex questions about the costs of political resilience when wielded without interruption. History, as always, will weigh both perspectives. Leaders are seldom judged solely by their victories or defeats, they are measured by the consequences of their choices and the broader transformations they inspire. Netanyahu's impact on Israeli society is undeniable. He has influenced policy, security strategy, and the nation's position on the global stage in ways few predecessors have managed. Decisions made during his long tenure, whether controversial or celebrated, will echo in the country's political and diplomatic trajectory for generations. Beyond policy and politics, his story also serves as a testament to the human dimensions of leadership. The losses he endured, such as the death of his brother Yoni Netanyahu, and the challenges of balancing personal ambition with national responsibility, reveal a leader shaped by both triumph and tragedy. These experiences, woven into decades of public life, illustrate the interplay between personal history and political destiny, a theme that resonates far beyond any individual biography. In reflecting on his legacy, one also encounters the paradox of enduring influence. Longevity can magnify both achievements and missteps. For Netanyahu, the extraordinary span of his political life has ensured that his decisions are scrutinized from multiple angles, and the debates over their significance are ongoing. Admirers and detractors alike recognize that his career has reshaped Israel's political landscape, and the effects of his leadership will continue to provoke discussion long after he leaves office. The question of how history will ultimately judge Netanyahu remains open. Will he be remembered primarily as a statesman whose resilience safeguarded Israel and enhanced its international standing? Or will the controversies, political conflicts, and polarizing decisions define his place in the historical record? Perhaps his legacy will reflect both dimensions simultaneously, embodying the complexities of leadership in a nation constantly negotiating security, identity, and survival. In the end, Netanyahu's story is a reminder that leadership is never straightforward. It is a continuous negotiation between ambition, circumstance, and consequence. It is a narrative of endurance, strategy, and the human capacity to navigate crises, triumphs, and failures alike. His life in politics demonstrates that influence is not simply measured by the offices one holds, but by the indelible mark left on a nation's trajectory, a mark that invites reflection, debate, and, ultimately, the understanding that history often reserves judgment for those willing to endure where others might fall. As the chapters of his life and career draw to a close, one truth remains clear: Benjamin Netanyahu has carved a place in history that is as compelling as it is contested. For future generations, his story will serve as both caution and inspiration, a testament to the extraordinary complexities, pressures, and possibilities of leadership in one of the world's most challenging political landscapes. If you found yourself captivated by the story of Benjamin Netanyahu's early life and the family that shaped him, make sure to stay with us as we explore the next chapter, from elite military operations to the defining moments that forged a future leader. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss a single step of this incredible journey.